Radio Times. French President François Hollande declared war on ISIS after a series of coordinated attacks in Paris on Friday night and bombed the Syrian city of Raqqa last night. The terrorists targeted restaurant and concert goers, and the scenes of carnage are absolutely horrifying. It's estimated that 129 are dead, many more were wounded, some being treated for life-threatening injuries. ISIS took responsibility for the attacks, calling them the first of the storm, and calling Paris the capital of prostitution and obscenity. In the last 2 weeks, ISIS took responsibility for downing a Russian airliner and carrying out an attack in Beirut, Lebanon. Joining us now is Delaware Senator Coons. He sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. And Senator Coons, nice to have you back with us on Radio Times.
Thanks, Marty. Great to be on with you.
Nice to have you with us. There is a new video, ISIS saying that it was going to threaten an attack on the United States and its allies. Is the U.S. directly at war with ISIS?
We are, and we have been, I think, for more than 14 months. And one of the issues I keep raising in the Foreign Relations Committee, as does Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, is that we should have taken up and debated and passed by now the authorization of the use of military force against ISIS that the president sent up to us many months ago. We have so far failed to get a full debate on this issue in the Republican-controlled House and Senate, and I recognize and appreciate the concerns of our full committee chairman, Senator Corker of Tennessee, that we have a divided committee, we have a divided Congress, and he has publicly expressed concerns that if we have an unsuccessful debate, we don't reach consensus, and we don't actually authorize this campaign, that will weaken our efforts and send the wrong message. I still think that it's our role constitutionally to declare war, and the president sent us the appropriate notifications under the War Powers Act and sent up an authorization. I think we are at war, and we should be behaving as such, and the Congress should be carrying out its role. I also, frankly, think we have a responsibility to identify how we're going to pay for this war. That didn't happen in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was no specific funding mechanism or authorization or effort to assess the cost. That's a specific point I've raised publicly many times in the last year. I think we owe it to the brave men and women who serve us in our armed forces and to the taxpaying public to have a clear-eyed look at the costs, the strategy, and how we move forward as a united nation in facing the real risk that ISIS poses, not just to our regional allies, but now to all of our allies and to the United States.
Are you calling for the sending of troops back into that region of the world? And where would you send them? To Syria, to Iraq?
The troops are there, Marty. We've got 3,500 U.S. troops in Iraq. The president's recently announced the deployment of 50 Special Forces U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. We had a classified briefing that lasted several hours late last week on our current strategy against ISIS and both military actions and intelligence community activity. There's another briefing tomorrow over at the White House for a bipartisan group of us. And I frankly think the larger challenge we face is coming to some consensus on how many more troops and of what kind and for what duration. Like most Democrats, I oppose a significant U.S. troop deployment on the ground. I don't want to see us go back to having 10 or 20 or 50,000 U.S. troops on the ground. I think we're only going to be successful if the United States is providing intelligence and logistics, munitions and air cover, and the fighting on the ground is being done by Muslim troops, by Arab troops from the region, because, frankly, when the United States sent significant troop presence into Iraq, our troops became the focus. I think this is what ISIS wants. I think ISIS is dreaming of an opportunity to make this a perceived war of the Christian West against the Muslim Islamic true believers of the ISIS caliphate. And I think we need to work through our partners in Iraq, the Kurds who've been spectacular fighters, the Kurdish Peshmerga, and our regional allies, Turkey and Jordan and others, who have capable militaries and who could be pulled into a regional alliance. But we have some sharp divisions in our strategy toward Assad and his murderous regime that I think really has caused most of the chaos in Syria and created the opening where ISIS has emerged as this regional threat.
The Kurds did have some success last week in Iraq, taking back a city that had been taken by ISIS, and then a couple of hours later, you've got these attacks in Paris. How do you keep up? How does the U.S. and its allies keep up with the strategy that ISIS seems to be able to use so effectively?
Well, Marty, first on the ground, the town you're referring to, or the city, is Sinjar.
Right.
Sinjar sits literally astride the main resupply route from Raqqa in northeastern Syria to Mosul, the largest city occupied by ISIS in sort of north-central Iraq. And it was the terrified Yazidi and Christian residents of Sinjar who were fleeing up Sinjar Mountain that initially precipitated American military involvement and moved President Obama to send air and troops back into Iraq to try and prevent a genocidal massacre of the Yazidi. The fact that the Kurds have retaken Sinjar is one small measure of progress on the ground. There's also an effort underway to retake Ramadi, and the prospect of some successful effort to retake Mosul and to advance on Raqqa have been publicly discussed in recent months. But we do face a real challenge on the ground. The Iraqi forces are weak and in some ways divided. We've provided a significant amount of training and logistic support. The new government of Prime Minister Abadi is trying to reverse some of the significant errors made under the previous government in Iraq, where instead of a sort of a multi-faith, multi-sectarian military force that we had poured huge amounts of money and time into training and equipping, the previous government in Iraq had really turned it into a sectarian force and had taken out many of its most competent commanders. So there's a long road in terms of getting the Iraqi security forces really able to retake Mosul and able to retake more ground in western Iraq. In Syria, it's an even more complicated situation, particularly with the Russians now sending both air and ground troops. The Russians are beginning to take casualties. And frankly, Marty, it is the complexities, the difficulty, the tragedy of the Syrian civil war that is driving both the flood of hundreds of thousands, millions now, of refugees into the region and into Western Europe. And it is the challenges of being welcoming to refugees while securing borders against potential terrorist threats that's going to dominate the news and the politics of Western Europe now that there is some link suggested between one of the attackers in Paris and the Syrian refugees who are flowing into Western Europe.
And I have a couple more questions before you have to leave us. But is this a battle for territory, a battle over ideas, a combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. Look, at the end of the day, ISIS is a Muslim jihadist cult. It is a group that is trying to restore a medieval vision of Islam that has been denounced by virtually every Muslim cleric or leader in the region. This is a fight within Islam about its true meaning and its origins and its future. So it is both a fight for ideas and a fight for territory. ISIS has reestablished a medieval caliphate, and the way that they are treating people under their occupation, I think, is sowing the seeds of their own destruction, because the populace of Western Iraq is not going to tolerate the kind of horrors and abuses that they impose on people and land that they occupy very long. But because of spectacular attacks, tragic and terrible attacks like the one they just carried out in Paris, they are succeeding in drawing to their cause radicalized young men from all over the world. Something like 30,000 ISIS fighters have been killed in the bombing raids that have been carried out by the United States and our many coalition partners. There have been about 7,000 bombing sorties carried out out in Iraq and Syria. But every one of those ISIS fighters who's been killed has been replaced, and they frankly have more fighters on the ground today than they did a year and a half ago. So this is, to your question, Marty, both a war for territory and a war for ideas. And because it is a conflict within the Muslim faith over what is the true faith, there has to be a central role here for moderate, tolerant leaders in Islam to stand up and challenge the hateful and wrong ideas of ISIS and to challenge them on the ground. And I think that is the hard work that is being done by some of our regional allies who have convened leaders in the Muslim faith. But that makes it harder and more challenging and requires us to be more engaged and thoughtful in our interaction with our Muslim allies, from Turkey to Jordan to Morocco to Tunisia, and with our regional allies, including the Saudis and the Qataris and the Egyptians and many others who have a role to play in how we push back on ISIS.
Do you worry about a Muslim backlash in this country? And I noticed that a number of governors and some others in this country have said we need to close our borders to Syrian refugees that want to come to this country. How do we address that?
Well, we need to be appropriately vetting refugees who we welcome into our country from whatever background and whatever country they may come. And I do think there is a balance to be struck here between ensuring that we carry our part of the burden of welcoming refugees from around the world and making sure that we are ensuring that the safety and security of the American people, which is our first obligation, is met. I've recently sat and met with leaders of the Delaware Muslim community, and they have, I think, legitimate concerns about a backlash against the Muslim community in the United States, which is an overwhelmingly skilled and sophisticated, loyal, and engaged community of Americans who've come here as part of the diaspora from other parts of the world. This is a tragic and difficult part of our own history, Marty, is that, when there have been wars, folks who are from the region have often been the victims of some sort of retaliation. German Americans, for example, Italian Americans in the First World War, Japanese Americans most pointedly in the Second World War. So the idea that we have a Muslim American community that has legitimate concerns about how they are viewed and their safety, I think that is something we have to be mindful of, and we have to help engage and educate a broader American audience so they can distinguish between an extremist, radical cult that claims to be Muslim in ISIS and the law-abiding, loyal American communities that include many mosques and many folks who are eager to serve and support the United States. We have Muslim police officers.
I hate to do this to you, Senator, only because
it's important for us to recognize.
We are out of time. Senator Chris Coons, thank you for joining us today on Radio Times.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome. Delaware Senator Chris Coons. Much more after this short break.